Man, the government should really do something about these First Nations people.
Actually, back in 1876, they did do something.
How did you get in my house?
Shh, that doesn't matter. As I was saying, back in 1876, the Canadian government was still very ethnocentric. Come on, follow me.
Wait, what happened?
Alright, so let's start at the beginning. The Canadian government saw Aboriginals as people that needed guidance to the correct lifestyle, according to the Europeans.
What did they consider to be correct?
Well, they considered their lifestyle to be superior to others. For example, the Canadians back in the day were mostly Catholic and they didn't approve of other religions or cultures. But the First Nations did have their cultures and traditions that weren't Catholic. So naturally the church would want them to convert. And the Aboriginals also had their own language. Oh, thank you. They also had their own languages that Canadians did not approve of because they thought that English and French were God's languages and they were the only allowed languages.
I see, but you still didn't answer my original question. What did the government do back then?
Well, they were in charge of protecting the collective rights of First Nations, but they also wanted to assimilate them. We must find a way to turn these savages into normal people like us while still protecting their rights. But how?
How about we introduce a law that will allow the Indians to have some land and for them to hunt, but we also take away their rights to traditional clothing, their rights to travel, and their rights to participate in traditional ceremonies.
And we also don't let them vote. We'll call it the Indian Act. It's perfect.
Perfect.
Goodbye.
So you're telling me they let them keep some rights, but also took several rights away from them just because they were Aboriginals?
Yeah, and that's not the only way they were assimilated. Come on, follow me.
What else did they do?
Another way they assimilated First Nations children was through residential schools. Observe. Well, Nicholas Davin, I have a job for you.
What is it?
I need you to find out what the best way is to take First Nations children, educate them, and assimilate them at the same time.
Consider it done. Give me a few months. Pleasure doing business.
6 months later.
What do you have for me, Davin?
This is my report. I found that residential schools are the best way.
Why would you say that?
Because it will allow us to take Indian children away from their families. It will forbid them from speaking their language. And it will stop them from practicing their traditions. This way we will assimilate them and make them learn from a young age.
So what were residential schools?
Residential schools were schools that the government made and forced First Nations children to go to so they could be assimilated.
But how were they assimilated?
You see, in these schools, Aboriginal children were not allowed to speak their native languages or do anything other than what Canadians wanted them to. They were forced to speak English and French, they were forced to learn Catholicism, they weren't allowed to see their families other than a few select rare visits. It was all very cruel.
Why wouldn't the government let them wear traditional clothing?
You see, if they were to wear their traditional clothing and not buy the clothing from stores, then they wouldn't be paying as many taxes to the government. The government wouldn't get as much money.
So it's all about the money?
Isn't it always?
I wonder how the First Nations felt about the situation.
Well, they used to be free people who would go wherever they wanted, had their own processes of government and all that stuff. But then, France came, Britain came, and then Canada was formed to create laws like the Indian Act, which restricted their rights, which restricted what they were allowed to do, and life was hard for them.
So what did the First Nations do to retaliate against the government?
Well, they made treaties with Great Britain because they felt that ever since the first treaties, the government just couldn't keep up with them. They couldn't provide the First Nations their rights. And eventually they got tired of being assimilated and of their culture being destroyed. So they made their own treaties with the government to preserve their status and their rights and to be able to perform their traditional ceremonies and wear their clothes.
What happened to the Indian Act now?
Well, in 1985, the government passed Bill C-31. What it was an amendment to the Indian Act. Bill C-31 stated that First Nations that lost their status because of marriage or enfranchisement would regain that status. And it would also give status to anyone who was denied it because of discriminatory reasons. Enfranchisement was when a person would purposely give up their rights as Aboriginals and would give up their treaty rights in order to live more normal lives and have the right to vote. Also, just a few months ago, the government swore that they would stop gender-related discriminatory things that happen to Aboriginal people. They proposed another amendment to the Indian Act that would restore status to women and children that did not get it, that were born before 1985.
Wow, the First Nations really had a tough past.
Yeah, exactly, which is why you shouldn't just say things like the government should do something about them. Because a few hundred years ago they did, and it didn't end well.